It was one of the most turbulent decades in human history. A global war devastated Europe. Revolution rocked Russia and shook the world. In Ireland, the demand for independence would eventually lead to the partition of the island. The first steps in a long journey towards gender equality was beginning with women's suffrage, and the voice of Labour was being heard louder than before. With old certainties under challenge, the staid world of banking began to feel the spirit of change. As workers throughout Ireland joined together to confront oppressive employers, bank officials too began to reflect on the widening gap between their pay and their presumed social status. In September 1917, around 40 bank officials met in the Glentworth Hotel in Limerick to discuss how to address the situation. Despite some initial scepticism, local committees were also formed in Cork, Dublin, Belfast, Derry and Galway, and began to build support for a new national body to represent bank officials. At its launch in Dublin's Mansion House on March the 17th, 1918, a total of 1,441 bank officials, around 50%, had pledged their support for the organisation, with former bank official turned solicitor Charles Denroach in the chair. 350 delegates voted to create the Irish Bank Officials Association and elected an executive committee mandated to seek recognition from their employers as the first step towards improving their conditions. While IBOA wanted to advance its cause through reasoned argument, the 9 associated banks refused to accept independent arbitration, but the fledgling organisation continued to recruit new members. So, by its first anniversary in March 1919, over 2,300 bank officials had joined, or 80% of all bank staff in Ireland, a figure that reached 95% a few months later. In the face of employer indifference, IBOA began lobbying political representatives and highlighting its concerns in the press. It also bought a few shares in each of the 9 banks so that it could take part in shareholders' meetings to highlight its members' concerns. Formally appointed as organising secretary in September 1919, Denroach again urged the banks to recognise IBOA, warning that failure to do so would lead to strike. And when the banks began considering a lockout, using strike breakers from Britain, the executive committee developed its own contingency plans to seek a banking licence. If the need arose, the association would establish its own bank, staffed by locked-out members, with a branch in every town where strike breakers were deployed. Meanwhile, to prove the strike threat was no bluff, the executive held a national ballot. For a group of workers often accused of being cautious and even timid, the outcome was decisive. 2,437 for strike and just 91 against. At its November meeting in Dublin's Gresham Hotel, the executive served strike notice on the 9 Irish banks, with the action due to begin on December 31st. When the banks demanded each employee sign a declaration disavowing the strike, the IBOA response was emphatic. If the declaration wasn't withdrawn, the strike would begin immediately on December the 3rd. With the public backing calls for arbitration, the Ministry of Labour in London intervened on December 2nd. The banks agreed to enter into talks with IBOA, so the strike was suspended. 2 days later, IBOA had won recognition, with the right to represent members on pay, pensions, working time and other matters. And the employers also acceded to another IBOA demand, an arbitration tribunal to consider pay and conditions in banking. So, at a time of unprecedented economic, social and political turmoil, both nationally and internationally, IBOA had managed to establish itself as the collective voice of virtually every bank official in Ireland. It had also been clearly accepted as such by the public, by local and national government and, albeit grudgingly, by the 9 major Irish banks. and all in the space of 27 months. In the following decades, IBOA maintained the loyalty of most bank officials from its head office in St Stephen's Green. Though IBOA registered as a trade union in 1942 to protect its right to negotiate with employers, it still declined to join the Irish TUC. Though membership numbers fluctuated in line with the level of banking services and the changes resulting from mergers between institutions, as well as the expansion of AIB and Bank of Ireland into Britain in the 1960s, the broad trajectory was towards continuing growth based on maintaining membership density in each employment. However, that trend changed after the joint action taken by the banks over the course of 1991 and 1992. Having bought off most of the managers with a secret pay rise, the employers set the scene for a major confrontation over a general pay claim in late 1991. When the claim was rejected, IBOA responded in early 1992 with limited industrial action calculated to minimise inconvenience to customers while hurting the bank's bottom line. But the employers escalated the impasse into a crisis with a series of provocative actions, threatening a 20% pay cut in 3 of the 4 banks and implementing arbitrary suspensions in the 4th, AIB. And when the banks announced further unilateral changes in terms and conditions, IBOA had no choice but to launch full-scale industrial action in all banks. But an orchestrated campaign of intimidation by local managers led a significant number of members to pass the picket in an increasingly bitter dispute. After Congress intervened, settlement terms were eventually brokered and narrowly accepted in a ballot of members. But the 1992 dispute fractured the association. Around 4,000 members, 1,000 of them branch managers, were expelled for defying the picket. The loss of over a quarter of its membership not only undermined IBOA's bargaining strength, it also affected its capacity for future recruitment. Up to this point, branch managers had played an influential role in persuading new bank officials to join the association. But with few branch managers left in IBOA, that influence was all but ended. Yet, despite inflicting major damage on IBOA, the employers failed in their key objective of destroying it. Indeed, the events of 1992 also prompted IBOA to affiliate to Congress, finally taking its place in the wider union family. But as IBOA developed new rules of engagement with the employers, which saw enterprise-level bargaining instead of sector-wide negotiations, a new crisis emerged in Northern Ireland, where the board of Northern Bank launched a new cost-cutting programme while completely bypassing the union. A one-day stoppage in September 1994 forced management to engage with IBOA under the auspices of the Labour Relations Agency, where an agreement was reached. But the agreement was soon in tatters when the bank proposed a new pay structure involving a £5,000 pay cut for hundreds of staff in return for a once-off lump sum payment. In a rare show of cross-community consensus, the leaders of 3 of the North's main political parties, Aon Paisley of the DUP, John Hume of the SDLP and John Alderdice of Alliance, backed union appeals to Northern Bank's parent, National Australia Bank, to reconsider the pay proposals. The bank refused to yield, but offered more commitments on job security and promotions. Staff voted to accept the proposals against the advice of the union. This was undoubtedly a setback for IBOA, but it has since worked to rebuild its influence within Northern Bank and maintain recognition. In the new millennium, and especially after the onset of the banking crisis, Irish banks have outsourced many support functions to a new wave of fintech companies, presenting new challenges for the union in representing workers. The union has achieved some success in securing recognition in a more diverse range of employments, not least in IBM, despite its global reputation as a company resistant to unionisation. But clearly, more needs to be done. As technological change, accelerated by the banking crisis, continues to reduce direct employment in banks, FSU must actively seek new opportunities to build membership in order to maintain its bargaining power within the financial services sector.